In the land where civilization began again after the catastrophic global flood that had destroyed the old world, leaving only Noah and his family that had survived in an ark and landed on the mountains of Ararat. From the writings of Marco Polo about the ark, it is written, "In the central part of Armenia stands an exceedingly large mountain, upon which, it is said, the ark of Noah rested, and for this reason it is termed the mountain of the ark." Is the ark still on top of the mountain, or has it been destroyed by the elements in the process of time? There have been a number of expeditions over the years to Mount Ararat, and others have claimed to have seen it still there. Dr. Carl Baugh, the co-director of 2 of the expeditions to Mount Ararat, has agreed to an interview to discuss the findings of the expeditions.
It was 1989 when Dr. Don Shockey contacted me. Dr. Shockey had just returned from the surveillance of Mount Ararat, and he was planning a full-scale expedition and wanted me to be co-director with him. So we ended up as co-director. I raised the funds, and we had the Ararat 8, symbolic of the original 8 people on the ark, and we flew, Don Shockey, Robert Summers and I flew to Turkey to make special arrangements and get the permit to fly the following year. To have attempted to fly without a permit would have been suicide. To have attempted to climb Mount Ararat without a permit would have been suicide. So we went in 1989 for the special arrangements, which took weeks to carry out. Then in 1990, when we did arrive, we had to, with the entire team of 8, we had to make special arrangements with a helicopter company. One of our supporters who had promised financial support had wanted us to fly a Sikorsky. A Sikorsky would have been a much better plane under all the conditions, weather conditions, terrain conditions, potential landing conditions. But the nearest Sikorsky was in Switzerland, and we had a window in our permit. It would not have been possible to get it there. We first tried to get a Sikorsky. So we negotiated with the local helicopter company in Ankara, and we were able to lease a Russian-built helicopter. And Sikorsky was not Russian-built. Sikorsky would not have been permitted by the Russians to fly. We had to have a helicopter that was permitted by the Russians and flown by the Russians. So the helicopter company in Ankara made special arrangements, and the Mi-8 Russian-built helicopter, 29-place helicopter, was leased by them to us, and the pilot and to a co-pilot and another assistant were involved. The price was $90,000, and that was 1989. And my wife had to raise that amount of money. It was not in our budget originally. We were considering more like $20,000. And the sponsor pulled out, so my wife had to raise the money. And because of those arrangements, we were able to fly, and it was relatively successful. We were very fortunate in the selection of individuals involved in the program. Dr. Walter T. Brown was selected because of his expertise, military background, and because of his research on Ararat. We had a businessman specifically selected, and he had climbed Ararat many, many times and was able to verify some of the things that we saw as being ice and snow covered. He had seen them when they were not ice and snow covered. But a very special member of the team was Glen Rose, Texas artist Robert Summers. Bob Summers sculpted the 9.5-foot John Wayne, the 9.5-foot Byron Nelson, the 9.5-foot Tom Landry, sculpted the largest bronze monument in the world, the Trail Drive downtown Dallas. Bob has a special ability to interpret activities and artifacts in a scene, and we needed his expertise. We had to fly the Russian-built helicopter very rapidly. We were not able to hover. We were going to have to look at the details of our photography after the fact. And Bob was selected because he has a genius approach at observing details that have to do with the landscape and artifacts. So he was able to point out some things that we didn't see at all. And it turned out that he was one of the most valuable members of the team. Getting permission to fly Mount Ararat is not an easy task, and it took negotiation with the emissary President Yuzov to get the permission for us to use a Russian-built Mi-8 helicopter. Now, it had to be Russian-built, and it had to be flown by a Russian pilot. His name was Yuri. All this is simply because the Russians have a base, a military base, and they claim the airspace from the north over Mount Ararat, and we were, of course, going to be flying in that airspace, not over Russia itself, but they have a military and satellite and launch station just over the border. But Yuri had flown Brezhnev and Gorbachev, and as we began to fly, he had to patch into them to let them know that we were not aiming even our cameras in their direction at all. He said, don't shoot, we're not filming you. We're looking for a boat. How do we know you're who you claim to be? He said, patch me into the Kremlin. So they patched him into the Kremlin, and he chatted for a few minutes. It was Yuri who had flown Brezhnev and Gorbachev. They visited for a while and then disconnected, so we were able to perform 11 separate helicopter sortie expeditions around Mount Ararat, basically because of his connection with the Kremlin and his assurance constantly that we were not filming them. However, their guns were aimed directly at us throughout the entire series of episodes. We had difficulty after a few of the flights because the local Kurds were assembling. They felt that they owned the mountain. They felt that they owned the artifact on the mountain, and we had no right to be there. So it took a couple of days of negotiation, and then we had to assure them that we were flying out. But we were able to perform 11 separate helicopter sortie expeditions. Being co-director, administration has its own responsibilities, and so you have to work with all of the local authorities. You have to make sure that everything is in order. But Yuri and Walter Brown, since Walter Brown spoke some Russian, PhD having to do with a lot of military artifacts, so they were able to exchange communication, and Bob's very knowledgeable. Robert Summers very knowledgeable in that area as well. So the three of them got together and determined that even if I couldn't get permission to land, and I was not able to get permission for us to land the craft on Ararat. It was not designed or built to even fly at 17,000. It was designed to fly at 10,000, even though we did fly at 17,000. But I had practiced some rappelling. Walter Brown was good at rappelling. Bob Summers was very good at rappelling. And they had determined that worst case scenario, as co-directors, Don Shockey and I were not able to get permission for us to land the craft. They were going to rappel and accomplish the mission anyway. Now, of course, that would have been an extremely risky thing to do. Because of the ice and the snow, the terrain, you can step off a cliff and it's 300 feet to the bottom. But they were behind my back, my friends, and they are my friends. They were planning worst case scenario. But they never got to pull that off. And I know these men, they probably could have and would have pulled it off. And this is the main mountain, the greater Ararat. The scripture says the ark landed in the mountains of Ararat. So we have the Abich glaciers here that have been identified for a century and a half. And Bob Summers and I discussed with you the terrible volcanic eruption that occurred in 1843. It blew out 1/6 of the mountain, literally 1/6 of the mountain was blown out. And it blew huge boulders as far away as 20 miles. And I was in this area and personally saw some of those boulders half as big as boxcars. Here's our site. This is what we call the Shockey site, because he was able to obtain this information. And when you look very closely, there is a structure. Our satellites interpreted this structure as being organic, meaning wood. There's a structure, barge-like structure. The end of the barge-like structure is here. You see this icicle hanging off. There's actually a series of steps running through here, and the planking in this direction. And 800 feet below it, we have an area of debris, of material that had fallen out of it, and this is the debris field. I personally saw a huge beam of laminated wood, that beam right there, as we flew Mount Ararat. And here are two broken structures, water reservoirs. Here is a ramp inside, and for that reason, we knew how to build the ramps, we knew how to build the water reservoirs. Ed Davis, who is now deceased, had performed a special favor for the people of the area. So Abbas, whose family was commissioned to protect the ark and to actually kill anybody who got close. I mean, it's very cutthroat over there. Took him up to see the ark. He saw this. He saw 3 layers. He saw structural interlamination. On that particular trip, they were not able to get across that ravine due to the rain and the snow and the weather. So it got up to waist high, so they had to go down in peril of their lives. But he could see the other end that has now slid over to the gorge over here. But he was able to see how this structure was laminated, had been originally laminated to that structure, even though it had turned in the opposite direction.
The ark, now being in 2 pieces, is likely from volcanic eruptions, especially the one in 1843. Here we have at the Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose, Texas, a replica based on the Book of Genesis and the observations observed in the first expedition.
I'll never forget leaving Bayazit at the foot of Ararat. Our interpreter / attorney, who accompanied us at every step to assure our safety, informed us that the locals had reassembled and were going to shoot us out of the air. So we had to leave Bayazit, had to leave in a very obvious manner. Now, if you can imagine, there I was, co-director of the project, the raiser of the funding for the project, and I get motion sick. So Yuri said, I know how we can take care of this, and it'll be obvious that we're leaving. So we all got our gear, got in the helicopter the morning we were to fly back to Ankara, and he flew directly over and around Bayazit, doing dipsy doodles, doing figure 8s. It was very obvious, and people, as we were looking down from the air, people came out of their homes because of the noise factor. You ran out into their yards. People by the hundreds were seeing this helicopter doing dipsy-doodles, doing figure eights all over the place, and then heading completely out of sight. So I'm sure they still talk about the drunk, crazy pilot of a Russian-built helicopter losing control of his craft over to Bayezid. But he didn't lose control at all. It was part of the plan. Later, went back with the permission of the Turkish government. In so doing, it required the Turkish military to protect us. And they did. There were various stations where, during our zone of 72 hours of permission, they watched us every moment. They protected us from the local inhabitants who didn't want us on the mountain at all. But weather plus health factors aborted the program before we could assault the area where we had information, good information, that at least one component of the ark was probably in place. However, we were not able to physically approach the area, so therefore, no matter what our surveillance from the air indicates, without having accessed the site, without having procured some direct artifact that could be studied, could be analyzed, and could be verified, we cannot claim to have found any indication of Noah's Ark, no matter what our surveillance indicated. But we were able to gain a lot of information, and to our own satisfaction, the program was relatively successful.
Though no artifact has been examined from Noah's Ark, we have always known where it is at. Countless people have seen it throughout the ages. In ancient times, the Akkadians, Sumerians, and Assyrians called Mount Ararat the Mountain of the Gods, because they believed not only did their gods live there, but it was from whence their civilization had begun. Today the Kurds protect the Ark, considering it holy. But the ship that saves some can no longer save anyone. When Jesus closed the door of the ark, it was a sign to what he would say of himself in the future. I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved. Behold, Jesus stands at the door. If any man hears him and lets him into his heart, he shall be saved. This is what is important. Not a ship on a mountain, only confirming what we've always known.